Welcome to another virtual episode of The Forum, brought to you by ACCTV. My name is David Lauderback, and I have the great good fortune of teaching history here at Austin Community College. I will be your host. The Forum is a roundtable talk show that gives us space to discuss openly important topics concerning the college and our community with faculty, staff, and students. Today, we will be discussing the evolution of voting in the United States, how it pertains to this ideal of we the people and why voting matters. Your vote is your voice, and hopefully this conversation will help support that. Joining to me today is someone who already has an impressive resume. Served as the Hispanic constituency with student government, now sits on as the ACC Commissioner to the City of Austin's College Student Commission, and will serve as the incoming Student Government Association President. Congratulations, Lira Ramirez. We also have with us Associate Professor of Government at Austin Community College, Dr. Kristie Kelly. She earned her BA degree at the University of California at San Diego, and her master's and Ph.D. from the University of Texas at Austin. She's our resident expert on American politics and voting behavior, with particular emphasis on youth vote choice and participation. Thanks for joining us today, Professor Kelly.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
In just a few weeks, we get to do something remarkable. We get to choose the people who will make our laws, execute our laws, and adjudicate our laws. We live in a representative democracy, an experiment in republicanism, if you will. And as citizens of the United States, we get to vote for the folks who will represent we the people. But many Americans do not vote or cannot vote. And the group least likely to vote in the United States are people under 35, especially those under 25. As important as voting is to our representative democracy, we have been reluctant to extend the right to vote. And we the people have had to push the nation to expand suffrage, but it's only happened slowly and over time, and often with serious limitations and impediments. Why? There has long been a tension in the United States between freedom and privilege, between those who want our government of we the people to expand opportunities for American citizens, and others who have sought to restrict access to protect their position and their privilege. When we look at the issue of voting historically in this new country, this new United States, it begins at the state level. And those state constitutions back in the 1780s heavily restricted voting based on property ownership, which meant that virtually only men with property got to vote. Now, in the case of Philadelphia, pretty much every white man with property got to vote. But when you went to South Carolina, the high property requirements restricted only a handful, a few dozen white men to be able to vote. In the 1820s and 30s, we actively as a nation, and particularly our political parties, looked to expand the vote. And by the 1840, we saw virtually universal white male suffrage in the United States. Sorry, women, sorry, anybody of color. We're not ready for that yet. 1870, with the 15th Amendment, we eliminated the restriction of race in voting. But then, as we will see, we promptly began to put all kinds of impediments to people to exercise that right to vote. In 1920, ladies, you got the right to vote. And then in the 1960s, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the federal government remembered that, in fact, we made a promise to people of color in this nation that they could get to vote. And then in 1971, we started our conversation with younger voters in the United States. And so I'd like now to shift the conversation over to Professor Kelly to talk a bit about the 26th Amendment, and how it changed the game, the playing field, the voice of who we the people are here in the United States. Professor Kelly.
Thank you. Well, we have to remember that the 26th Amendment was ratified in the early 1970s, really in the wake of the Vietnam War. Prior to this, you had to be 21 years old in most states to vote. But then with the Vietnam War, we have the draft, and Congress is sending 18 to 20-year-olds off to fight and die for their country. And yet we have these 18 to 20-year-olds who had no say as to who these legislators are, who are making these decisions with their lives. So the 26th Amendment is proposed in Congress in, I believe, March of 1971, and it was ratified by that same summer. It was the quickest ratification of an amendment among all of the amendments to the US Constitution. And you would think, wow, awesome. We have this whole new group of energized voters, and young people are going to make their voices heard. And then what happens? Well, when we look at turnout, we see turnout rates actually go down, in part because you've now expanded the denominator of eligible voters. And young people just didn't turn out to the polls as we expected. And historically, young voters have always been the least likely to vote on election day. And a lot of this is just because politics just doesn't factor yet into the hearts and minds of young people. And many don't recognize the relevance of government in their lives. But as you get older, you get used to adulting, so to speak. It really starts mattering more. You start getting higher paying jobs. You start paying higher federal and state taxes. You buy a house and now property taxes matter. You have kids and now school districts matter. So young people do care. Young people have, their issue preferences, but a lot don't realize or have harnessed their voting power yet. And we know that young people do have a different set of issue preferences than the older generations who do show up to the polls, right? We know that younger people care more about climate change, about income inequality, but many young people don't vote because they think, well, politicians don't care about me. Politicians don't listen to me. But maybe we should flip that script on its head and consider, maybe politicians don't pay as much attention to young people because young people don't vote. My colleague at UT, Sean Theriault, says we should really think of members of Congress as single-minded seekers of re-election. Every action they undertake, in the back of their minds, they're thinking, is this going to help my re-election process or my re-election prospects? So if young people were really to turn out at their full potential, you'd better believe that legislators would pay much more attention to the issues that young people care about.
Back in 1968, it was college students at the University of Texas who organized and mobilized, and they were able to push and change fundamentally the city council of the city of Austin that for many decades had been run by primarily Klansmen. And it was the students who worked, the students who organized, the students who got together, and they made a difference. So it is a huge vote. Ramirez, let me ask you this question. Professor Kelly's talked about how there are specific issues that mobilize younger voters, but also that there's this perception that, well, maybe my vote doesn't matter. For you and your generation, what does matter? And what is it that would draw you into elections, would make you think, yeah, voting is not only something I could do, but something I should do?
I think that a lot that goes into voting has to do with being interested and excited about everything that is going on within government, feeling like you can make an impact on all the different things. And I think it also comes down to just education. I think that I think that young voters are often new voters who may not know much about the process, who may not know much about the government. And I think that learning more, hopefully, gets people to be more interested in government and in participating in it.
Well, as a teacher, I certainly like the idea of education. That certainly sits right well with me. So let me ask Professor Kelly this lack of participation of voters once we got the 26th Amendment, what else was going on in the United States at that time that also led many other voters of other age groups to say, I just don't have confidence in this all anymore. I'm not sure that my vote's really going to make a difference. What is it that we're tapping into there?
To not get too political, I mean, the 1960s and 1970s were really a turbulent period in US history. I mean, we had, of course, the civil rights movement. We had, racial resentment issues really start popping up. Then you go into the 1970s and trust in government declines because of Watergate, because of the Pentagon Papers, right? So there's a lot of public mistrust in government that really increases cynicism among all age groups, but particularly those just coming of political age.
So we laid the groundwork for why even bother at a time when the youth vote could make such a big difference. Well, folks, we're going to take a short break now, but we'll come back to continue this conversation about the history and importance of voting. We're going to try to answer a question. Why, once we allow people the right to vote, do we work so hard to keep people from voting? Stay with us.
The Constitution is still the fundamental guiding principle of our U.S. government, the U.S. Constitution. And it is extremely relevant to how you live and what you do in your daily life in this country. And our idea was that we needed a way to show that to students who were interested in a way that they could internalize. So we came up with this interactive idea where we would give them issues that involved the Constitution and things that were relevant to their lives, issues that were relevant to their lives, and let them debate them.
I'm here volunteering. Also, I would like to listen because I think it's not something that I'm like super interested in, I guess you could say. So I definitely would kind of I like to put myself in positions where I have to kind of listen. I feel like a lot of people my age have so many opinions and they have so many great things to say and great things to bring to the table, but a lot of them don't go out and vote, which is like the only way that you can make change. You know, not just saying it on Twitter or not just saying it like to their friends or like actually like, you know, came together and like voted and did all that stuff. I think that there would be a lot more change.
You know, Constitution is a big thing that is constantly under threat, I think, more and more so today. It's getting bent to the will of some political parties. So I think it's super important for students to debate and be engaged in a discussion about the Constitution today.
I get excited every year about the Constitution Day, Debate Day celebration. We've been doing this for over a decade now. We get in a room filled with students and folks from the community, and they get to go to law school. They get to debate questions like students in law school do that are issues currently before the Supreme Court. They've got guides, they've got lawyers as well as judges to work the tables to facilitate the discussion. They get to debate the pros and cons of issues, understand what part of the Constitution matters, but most of all, it helps them to find their voice, to help them understand that they make a difference as citizens. They not only have the right to participate, they have the responsibility to participate. And this is a wonderful way to give them an opportunity to figure out, hey, yes, I can do this. My opinion does matter. I can figure this out. Let me do more.
The most exciting thing about this Constitution Day event is that I get to work with young children who are going to be our leaders of our country very soon. And they need to know what's in the Constitution, how it affects their daily lives, and how to protect it.
Welcome back to the forum where we're discussing the importance of voting. We've talked about this tension between the ideals of America, of our government representing we the people. But we've also talked about this tension between those who want to see that government expand opportunities for Americans and those who want that government to protect their privileges. We also mentioned how in the 1820s and 30s, we saw a huge surge in voting in the United States as the political parties in the United States, particularly the newly constituted Democratic Party, actively recruited white male voters. They wanted those voters to come out and vote. There were entire organizations created just to mobilize those voters. And in the course of the 19th century, we're going to see in off-year elections and national elections more than 80% of white men voting. And in national elections, when the president's elected, we're going to be talking about over 90% of Americans voting. In 1870, we talked about the 15th Amendment and how that extended the right to vote to people of color. But very quickly, we're going to discover that local and state leaders in the South and the North will actively seek to put in legal impediments to restrict non-white voters. When we get to the progressive era, the turn of the 20th century, a time of remarkable change in American history, electricity, streetcars, automobiles, radios, moving pictures, we're going to see an incredible activism amongst white, upper class, and upper middle class voters, women who were native born and Protestant, who wanted to be much more involved in American politics, and they pushed for their right to the vote, for women's suffrage. But these same reformers also reacted very negatively to the new immigrants coming into the United States. They were Southern and Eastern European, Eastern Orthodox, Jewish, Catholic. They were dark and swarthy skinned, and Americans were terribly xenophobic and nativistic and reacted powerfully against them. So we're going to be a period where we will see folks actively seeking to expand the right to vote for some. But then when we see a whole host of voter registration laws, you don't just get to go and vote, you now have to register to vote. And let me remind you of something Walter Dean Burnham told me. Registration laws exist to do one thing and one thing only, and that's restrict access to the ballot. And all sorts of requirements in northern cities were designed to keep immigrants from voting. In the South, the all-white primary, literacy and citizenship test, poll taxes were all designed to do one thing and one thing only, limit who got to exercise their right to vote. So let's talk now about the impediments to voting, in particular, the impediments to the youth vote. And so once again, I will turn to Professor Kelly. What have been some of the structural impediments to voting over time, and in particular, the youth vote?
Well, I think you hit on one of the biggest barriers to the youth vote, and that is this registration requirement. And we have to remember that the Constitution left voting rights to the states. So we have 50 different systems of election administration and 50 different requirements for registration. Some states like North Dakota don't even require registration. Minnesota allows for same-day registration. But here in Texas, you have to be registered at least 30 days in advance of an election. And for young people who are just learning, again, how to adult, right? Not having that education, as Ramirez mentioned earlier, is a real impediment, because many people don't realize you have to be registered in advance. And they don't realize, especially young people don't realize, you have to re-register every time you move. And young people, as you know, college students, move frequently. I know that when I was in my undergrad, I moved 6 times in the span of 4 years. And it's not at the top of your mind, oh, hey, I better go make sure I re-register to vote, because many people don't even realize that registration requirement exists.
Ramirez, we were talking about education, and we've also mentioned that there's this huge number of Americans who are under 35 and are under 25, and that means an awful lot of folks who are under 18. What might be some of the ways that we can reach out to those voters to help them to understand the process, to help educate them into how they can vote, as well as why they should vote?
I'm speaking as someone who is 17 at the moment. I am not old enough to vote yet. I think that I am very much a person who is very interested in all things government. Government has always been something that's excited me. As I get closer to 18, I'm waiting to be able to vote in this election, I'm watching everyone else and wanting to go vote. I think that education is important towards creating excitement towards voting. I think that even I'm not sure exactly when it happened, but I know that high schools started requiring civics classes, or at the very least that at Austin Community College, you're required to take Texas government and US government to be able to graduate. Maybe those requirements aren't the most fun thing, and it may not be the thing that people look forward to, but getting that class there in the first place does force people to start getting engaged and to start learning more, and maybe they will find out something that that they didn't know before, or will get excited in something that they didn't think they were going to get excited in.
Well, that particular requirement is one that the state of Texas put in place in the 1950s, having students in colleges take 2 semesters of history and take 2 semesters of government. I'm not going to disagree with it since I teach history, and I think Professor Kelly thinks it's a really good idea.
Love it.
But I'm not sure if those gentlemen back in the 1950s would really agree with us using it to mobilize younger voters to change America in profound and remarkable ways. But I think it's wonderful that you're thinking that. I think it's wonderful that you're thinking that. Professor Kelly, what are some of the impediments to voting that are put in by the folks who don't want people to vote? What are some of the things that municipalities and counties and states do to restrict access to the ballot?
One of the biggest things affecting Texas voters today is the voter ID requirement. In order to cast a vote in the state of Texas, you have to have one of 7 forms of valid ID. And after a series of lawsuits, the state has been forced to expand what IDs are accepted at the polls. Now you can cast a provisional vote with things like a utility bill or a bank statement under your name. But what this does is it disproportionately affects people with lower levels of education and lower levels of income who maybe don't have access to getting one of these required forms of identification, or maybe don't know that they need one of these forms of identification. We do know studies have shown that this disproportionately affects people of color. This disproportionately affects younger people who may not have a form of ID that has their current address on it, or have something like a utility bill or statement under their name.
So Ramirez, thinking about your drive for education, what might be something that you could think of that would help younger voters? And by the way, I got to say, rock on with your bad self that you're the new incoming president of SGA at 17 and are talking about voting. We are not worthy. We are not worthy. Thank you so much. I realize that's a reference to many years ago, but you know, I grew up painting on the cave walls in the south of France. So what might be some of the ways that we can reach out to younger voters, particularly those who are in the hopper, who are getting ready to vote, to be excited? Yeah, I can't wait until I'm 18 so I can get out there and be one of we the people and cast my ballot.
Well, let me think about that. I think that there's a couple of things that come into mind. I think in general, the culture around you, I think probably affects it. I think I have a family that is very interested in voting. Government class, I've heard about political socialization. Is your family excited about voting? Are your peers interested in voting? And I think that figuring out how to make voting, how to make the desire to vote kind of be normal and kind of just be something that is just there. It's not something that needs to be pushed constantly to try. I'm not exactly sure how to get to there, but I do think that it's important.
Well, think about this. Think about the last time you were excited about something. Think about the last time you wanted to get involved in something. How did you learn about it? And how did you spread the news?
I think in all honesty, I'm a person that tends to like doing lots of research. I do think that even a small thing though is just going around town and seeing there's political signs everywhere. You notice that an election is coming up. You see stuff, seeing things in different languages is also important as well, so that people can see what's happening.
Professor Kelly, what might be some ways that we can take advantage of our understanding of the structural impediments to voting and then come up with some targeted education and intervention campaigns that will help to mobilize our younger voters?
Well, like Ramirez said earlier, education is a huge part of that. We have lots of non-governmental institutions that are trying to help increase civic capacity by providing resources to everybody, right? To find out who's on the ballot, where your polling places are, and things like that. But the number one way to make sure people show up to the polls, first of all, is to talk about it, but then ask them to participate. Looking somebody in the eyes and saying, can I count on you to show up to the polls on election day, has been incredibly effective at turning people out to the polls, because now they have buy-in. Now somebody has asked them to participate. And I think that that's something that, Ramirez, I am so inspired by what you've mentioned and how enthusiastic you are about government and politics. And it takes people like you asking your peers to, hey, let's go to the polls. Let's make it a party. Let's show up together and get other people involved.
Well, thank you all very much. We're going to take a short break here again, but we will come back to continue this conversation and talk more about how we can get people involved and why we used to do that a lot and why we hardly ever do it anymore.
Hi, I'm Alejandra Polchik.
And I'm Megan Diaz.
Join us for the first ever bilingual Latinx show on ACCTV called Ready, Set, Ascender.
We'll be covering important topics at Austin Community College and in our community.
And you will get to meet some amazing people, hear their stories on culture, art, and education.
Be sure to tune in to Ready, Set, Ascender only on ACCTV.
Nos vemos!
Are you ready? Let's go. Are you ready?
Is ACC for fashion designers?
Yes.
Is ACC for directors?
Yes.
College transfers?
Yes.
What about the foodies?
Yes.
Is ACC for kids?
Yes. ACC is for everyone.
We've already learned that there are a number of different reasons why people vote, and clearly family remains one of the most powerful indicators of who votes in the United States over time. We've also seen how there can be larger societal issues that pull voters in, like the Great Depression in the 1930s that led to a massive mobilization of those new immigrants who'd been excluded at the turn of the 20th century to vote for the Democratic Party. We've also talked about how after 1968, there was this pervasive confidence gap that effectively led to a pushing away of people from the poll. But what we also need to remember is that throughout American history, up until the late 1970s, in particular in the Democratic Party, our major political parties actively campaigned, they organized, they mobilized. Precinct captains were the heart and soul of the Democratic Party because they got their voters to the polls. But since the 1980s, we've shifted to, we'll buy some ads on TV and the TV will draw in the voters we want and we can target our advertising just to get the people we want and maybe nudge away the folks we don't want to come to the polls. So let's shift our conversation to why do people vote? At the end of the day, why do people vote? And let's start talking about some of the ways that we can mobilize voters, especially those younger voters. Professor Kelly, what might be some way that we could do that? Based on your research, what would be some targeted ways that someone who wanted to see young people vote, what might be some ways they could do that?
Again, outreach. Outreach is huge. You mentioned before that the parties have sort of scaled back as in their turnout campaigns to get people to the polls. And a lot of that did happen with the proliferation of TV. So for many decades, campaigns were under this impression that they no longer had to do the boots on the ground canvassing that they used to do, because now they could campaign directly into people's homes. Well, decades of political science research has found that ads are good at persuasion, right? Getting people to change their minds about a candidate, not so good about exciting people and actually getting them out to the polls. So if you look at 2008 was a high turnout year. And a lot of this had to do with the mobilization game. As you mentioned earlier, political parties were really turning people out, but that outreach effort declined through the 1960s, 1970s, into the 1980s. And campaigns were wondering why. Why is turnout going down? We get a couple of political scientists in the early 90s who said, it all comes down to mobilization. It all comes down to knocking on people's doors. And again, looking them in the eyes and saying, can we count on you to turn out on election day? And since then, some campaigns have done a better job than others of the boots on the ground and getting people to turn out. And, you know, we have to credit Obama's campaign, whether you liked him or not as a candidate, they really focused so much effort on that. And in the more recent presidential elections, we haven't really seen that as much from either side. So, you know, a lot of that is just getting people's buy-in by asking them to participate.
Well, I'm thinking about the examples in 2016 of Arizona and Nevada. The Democratic Party launched an exclusively social media and TV campaign in Arizona, and it clanked horribly. But the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union in Las Vegas held parties, put people on buses, and drove them to the polls for early voting. And the California State Employees Union drove across the mountains into Reno and got as many Democratic voters as they could to the polls. Well, this is something that church groups have been doing for the Republican Party in Ohio for a very long time. Folks going from Texas all the way up to the Dakotas, driving into Ohio, getting lists of voters and saying, hey, I will be happy to drive you to the polls. Democrats are wondering, how the heck do the Republicans keep taking Ohio? Well, it might have something to do with Republican voters getting to the polls so they can vote for their candidate. So let me shift over to Ramirez. We've talked a bit about mobilization. We've talked a bit about how we can get people to the polls. How do we get to younger voters, even those who aren't ready to vote yet, to start thinking about mobilization? And what might be some ways we can reach younger voters better to not only encourage them to vote, but to have them commit to voting?
Well, I think that even apart from getting people excited about voting and having voting be a priority, right? The goal is to get voting to be a priority on a list of many things that the young people have in mind, whether that be schoolwork or anything else. I think that actually getting people to vote, I think, has to do with having voting be accessible and something that is easy to do too. Having a big list of voter registration things you have to do and all these different things you have to bring, that suddenly makes voting already seems daunting. It already seems, and adding more things to that list is just going to make that seem even harder to be able to accomplish. So at ACC last year when there was elections, I remember there were polling stations inside my campus, at South Austin campus, and I saw so many people walk in the door, go to the polling station, and come right back and up the stairs and go to class, because that was just one step along, and there's a voting station right there. So I think especially with college campuses, having polling stations on college campuses when possible. Coronavirus, of course, has made everything a lot trickier. Maybe voting in person is no longer something that feels safe or that you may feel comfortable doing. So I think there's a lot of different things that play a role.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, it's called making it easy for folks. Why do folks put impediments to voting? because they don't want you voting. Why do we have all of these restrictions? They're designed to limit the ability to vote. Whenever my students ask me, do I think that your vote matters? I say, well, I know that an awful lot of folks are trying to take it away from you. So that kind of answers the question for me. So let's talk some more about some ways in which we can ease access to voting, and also some of the ways in which we can inform voters, especially younger voters, about how they can vote. Dr. Kelly, go back to your research and talk to us a bit, talk us through a little bit. What would be some of the more effective ways to mobilize younger voters?
Well, again, it all comes down to getting people's buy-in, getting people excited. When I wrote my dissertation, one of the things that I found was that young people tend to only hear the loudest shouts from the political world, meaning the biggest issues that young people really only pay attention to the biggest issues that personally affect them, right? So you can say, oh, climate change really matters, but maybe that's not going to drive you to the polls. What does tend to drive people to the polls are economic recessions. Young people historically get hit the hardest by economic recessions, and that's in part why we saw such a huge level of turnout among young voters in 2008. We see the same thing when it comes to wars and deploying troops. Who are those people? They tend to be younger people who are being deployed to fight and die for their countries. And I think this year, with an economic recession and of course coronavirus, I'm not going to put money on turnout, but I would suspect that we're going to see an increase in turnout in the 2020 presidential election, simply because people are fired up, people are upset. And we often, in political science, there are many, many theories as to why people turn out. But a very strong theory is that people turn out as a referendum on the current administration and what's going on in the world. And people turn out when they're upset. There's competing theories in political science about whether low turnout is a good thing or a bad thing. Now, some people will actually argue low turnout is not bad because it signals people are happy with the status quo. And when you have high levels of turnout, it's because people are upset. And I think that it's not a guess to hazard that we're going to see lots of people fired up for this coming election.
Well, and you've just talked about one of the structural processes of voting. When folks are happy and comfortable, they generally tend to stay home. Well, if we're talking about expansion of liberties, if we're talking about expansion of rights, if we're talking about making sure we celebrate all of we the people, that type of inertia is the complete opposite of what we need. That's the complete opposite of folks who are advocating for change. And I know that historically, the economy has been the number one driver in why the folks who are most likely to vote do vote. Why did Bill Clinton have on the top of his bus, "It's the economy, stupid. Talk about the economy, talk about the economy." And I'm trying to think, has there ever been a time in American history when a president running for re-election saw such absolute devastation to the economy? Got to go back to Herbert Hoover in 1932 to have anything come close in terms of unemployment and those things that might lead to that mobilization. And Ramirez, you brought up a good point, which is the specter of COVID-19 that adds an additional impediment to voting. So let me ask you this question. For younger voters, how can we address their concerns about COVID-19? What might be a useful way of saying, hey, you still can vote and here's how you can do it?
Right now, we're left with one option. We can go in person to vote, right? And we have the option to go on election day when everything would be incredibly busy, lots of people. There are few polling locations right now and long lines to wait in. Can vote early. Voting early gives a little bit more time for extra and to not have COVID-19 be as much of a concern. But early voting is also one of these things that is getting challenged right now, as is the ability to vote by by mail. Voting by mail is in the courts constantly right now. It is definitely, I'm not sure if it's become a political issue, if it has been a political issue for a while. I think it may be a little bit more of the latter. I feel like every option is kind of trying to make a narrower window at the moment.
Well, we need to get you as a talking head on MSNBC and all the rest, because you're addressing these issues as precisely and as focused as any of those high-priced talking heads could do. So I will salute you for that. We're going to take another break here, but we'll be right back. And we want to try and talk more specifically about how we can mobilize voters. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into the value of early voting, particularly for our younger voters. Stay tuned.
My name is Sydney Campbell. I'm an area study advising specialist at the Northridge campus for ACC, and we're at ACC Fest 2019. ACC Fest is a way for the community to come out and be able to see all the programs that we offer, talk to different faculty and staff. The event is mostly for probably seniors in high school, really the community, anyone who is seeking a way to a career, maybe wanting to better themselves, get a better job.
There's all kinds of resources available to them for the community, for online courses to improve their skills and their knowledge, and then, of course, increase their income eventually. It's important for them to understand all these resources. They may not be aware of everything that ACC has to offer, and it's especially important for the staff to connect with future students.
ACC is for everyone, so anyone who's interested in finding a career, bettering their life, or just wants to learn, this is the place you want to be.
Welcome back to the forum. We're discussing voting, and in particular, how we can mobilize younger voters, I want to start first by talking about the type of information that we already do have, the type of places we can go to answer some of the questions that we have about voting. So I'll start first with Professor Kelly. What is available out there to voters to help them understand what voting's about and how they do it and how they get it all done?
Well, the best resource to learn about how elections are conducted in your area is to go to your county website. I know that Travis, Williamson, and Hayes counties all have an elections page dedicated to the upcoming election. And on your county website, you'll find out, who some of the candidates what positions are on the ballot, I should say. You can find out where your polling places are, both for early voting and on election day. And a very cool feature on these websites, at least in Travis and Williamson, and I believe Hayes has it too, is you can see what the wait times are at the various polls in the county. And I know all 3 counties use county-wide vote centers, meaning you don't have to go to a specific polling place. If you're registered in Travis County, you can vote at any polling place in Travis County. Hit that county website before you plan to head to the polls and see what the wait is. You know, in the 2016 election, my husband called me. He's like, you know, I'm going to be at this polling place for at least an hour. The line's really long. I jumped on the county website and said, there's a polling place 2 blocks away from you that has a 15-minute wait. So he got in his car, went to the other location and voted, and got home in the time it would have taken him to just stand in line at that original location. So the county website is your friend. And I will say, for those of you who live in West Campus, the West Campus polling stations at UT are the busiest, are 2 of the busiest in Travis County, especially on the last day of early voting and election day itself. So if you live in that area, maybe make a plan to visit a different part of the county or a different polling place.
And that's the kind of information we need, particularly since one of the more common tactics by counties and municipalities to disrupt the voting process is to change where polling stations are and then not announce them or not broadcast them. So going to those county websites and going to other websites from your political party, the League of Women Voters, from your college, your university, these are things that you want to find out ahead of time, so that when you do go to vote, you've got a sense of where you can go and what you need to do. Ramirez, talk to us about how we can use these types of existing educational means, these websites. How can we make them more accessible to younger voters? How can we make younger voters more aware that they exist?
I think first of all, I have been one to frequent some of these county websites before. I think it may be a little bit of some formatting and design stuff could definitely be helpful for this website. May not be the first thing that you think of. Having some very simple, nice little graphics and charts and little things, as opposed to, because I know that it can sometimes be very hard to scroll through lots of text and what may seem like an overwhelming amount of information. That said, those sites, even if you do need to look for it a little bit, have lots of extremely great information right there, and especially the wait times that you both mentioned are incredibly helpful, especially this year, as having longer wait times means that there's more people in a location, which means that there's also likely an increased risk of coronavirus spread.
I'll tell you, it sounds like we need to get a whole bunch of younger voters working with the IT development staff in our coursework here at ACC to come up with some term projects. How can we design some really good, snappy web pages that are going to reach out to people? And I've discovered something with my students. You all are the swipe generation. You swipe left and right. I'm the old guy. I'm used to scrolling up and down. And when I was telling my students, you need to scroll down, they look at me like, what? I'm like, you have to go up. Oh, you mean it doesn't swipe? Sorry, old white man. Okay, that's part of the drill. That's part of the drill. Okay, so this is a good way for us to be talking about how to get access to that information. Now let's talk about what you do when you know where you need to go and the power of early voting. I'm going to talk about the power of early voting to help folks against their concerns about COVID-19, but also mobilize folks. So I'm going to turn this over to both of you all. What can be a good way? What do you think might be a very good way that we can mobilize younger voters into taking advantage of early voting?
Well, I really want to emphasize this idea that that the busiest days for voting are election day itself and the last day of early voting. And it's my hunch, I don't have any data to prove this, but given my observations while I was at UT and seeing the lines during early voting, I think young people tend to push off actually casting their vote during the early voting period until the very last minute. Now, part of this is, oh, hey, I still have to do research on the candidates. I still, I have to figure out what I'm doing. I think one of the things that we need to do for everybody, but especially for young people, is to make a plan and stick to it. Actually put some time in your calendar. I am going to vote on the 4th day of early voting, and give yourself a lot of time. Give yourself at least a 2-hour window, just in case lines are going to be longer than you expected. Because one thing that I saw quite frequently at UT was people would show up to the polls on the last day of early voting, wait an hour in line and go, oh, I don't have time for this. I'll come back on election day, only to find out that their line was now 2.5 to 3.5 hours long. So having that plan to show up early and then giving yourself enough time to actually cast the vote in case of long lines is really important. And I should also point out that this is going to be the first presidential election year where straight ticket voting is not an option. So voters will actually have to go through every single race on the ballot and individually click, which is just going to extend voting times and voting lines. On top of that, most of our poll workers tend to be older people, and something that not just Travis County, but all over Texas, we're going to see a dearth of poll workers. So one thing that I would really encourage young people to do, if they have the capacity and are brave enough during the COVID-19 pandemic, is volunteer. The counties all are asking for students, for young people to volunteer their time, and it's a great way to serve your community. So I would highly suggest anybody who has any interest in participating in elections beyond just voting to look at that as an option.
So Ramirez, how can we reach out to younger voters and let them know that these volunteer opportunities exist?
I think this once again has to do a little bit where are people's attention, because you can have you can have a yard sign or something, but are people going out to see those signs right now? What kind of things are they looking at? Well, maybe students are checking their email, maybe they're checking social media. Social media is definitely a big thing. I also think that as far as just going to the polls and early voting in particular, that I think a lot of the excitement tends to be around mobilizing people on election day. Election day is this big thing. It's on calendars everywhere. On election day, you see stuff everywhere. Election day is coming up. Not always as much stress on early voting. Early voting is just kind of it's for the overachievers. So to speak, it's the people that are there before. There's also big tendency, as Professor Kelly mentioned, to procrastinate. I have more time, I'll do it the next day. Okay, the next day, and it just keeps on going aside. As far as there's no straight ticket voting. I think that something I still cannot vote, but something that I like to practice every year is filling out a sample ballot. I believe you can find those on the county website, and getting that filled out in advance and being able to bring that to the polls can be very helpful, especially if you are having to figure out, so you're not trying to figure out decisions in the moment and having to try to frantically search for that.
That's a really good point that I want to jump in. So bring a paper sample ballot with you to the polls, because one thing you cannot bring with you is your cell phone. Your cell phone has to be turned off and put away for security reasons. So if you put in your phone, like in your little notes app, oh, who I'm going to vote for, you're not going to be able to access that at the poll itself.
And I hope the campaigns were paying attention to Ramirez, because she just told them how to win. Okay, folks, we're coming to the end of our time together. I want to thank you so much for being here. And I want to talk about this one last point. To folks who say, oh, my vote doesn't matter. I don't know why I should bother to do this. Could you share with our viewers why that vote matters and how they can make a difference with that one vote?
Sure. Well, people tend to focus a lot on the presidential election, but we also have to remember we have many down ballot races that are sometimes won on the margins. I mean, maybe your vote doesn't make that much of a difference when you have 120 million other people voting in a presidential election, But we have local elections that are sometimes won by 1 or 2 votes. And it's these local elections, these local positions within government that actually have a more direct impact on our lives, like ACC trustee elections, right? They get to make decisions on tuition. So I think that we often underestimate some of these down ballot races where our votes can absolutely make or break a candidate.
I think that I absolutely agree about the down ballot elections. I've seen some results in election, and I'm like stuff can get really, really, really close sometimes. There's no way of predicting that in advance. I do think that there is certainly a tendency to think that I am one person, or even I am one person, so I'm just one person not voting. There's still plenty of other people that can vote, and there's still plenty of other people that can do that. But I think that those one person adds up over time, because then there's one person who decides I'm not gonna vote. There's plenty of other people. And then there's another person and another person, and suddenly that become hundreds and thousands of people who have also made that same decision. People for many years have worked really hard to fight for the right for everyone to be able to vote. And I think that we are very much in a democracy, and I think that democracy cannot work if we don't participate and if we don't put our voice in, because that's the whole point.
I want to thank all of our guests today. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your thoughts and for your energy. And to our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us. Remember, there is much more helpful information on our website at austincc.edu/ACCvotes. That's austincc.edu/ACCvotes for how to register to vote and other specifics. Remember, folks, the reason you know your vote matters is that folks are trying to take it away from you. So come out and join the party.